Today, I'm bringing to you an episode that couldn't be more timely. In a world where the fabric of our society is strained by the events unfolding in the Middle East, we're joined by an individual who is tirelessly working to bridge the chasm that separates us. Through the Minaret Foundation, Shariq Abdul Ghani is a beacon of hope, proving that faith communities working together can be the cornerstone of change. Let's hear his story as a struggling immigrant in a conservative Texas suburb. A young Shariq would face an uphill battle finding new ways to navigate change. In a community divided by opposing opinions, Shariq's combination of relationship building and driving meaningful policy changes would start to bring people with different belief systems together. In a world torn apart by discord, his journey is a testament to the idea that even in the face of seemingly insurmountable divisions, we can find common ground. Join us as Shariq shares his intimate journey from humble beginnings to enacting much-needed policy change and bringing communities together. Let's dive in. Welcome to Something from Nada, the only podcast designed to explore entrepreneurial stories of determination, focusing on first-generation immigrants and underserved leaders. In each episode, we'll introduce you to the unlikely changemakers, shattering intergenerational cycles as they defy the odds to build something amazing from nothing. My name is Nada Ahmed, and I am your host. Hi, Shariq. How are you?
I'm doing well. Having a good time. I just had a kid, so I've got sleepy brain right now.
Yeah, I know what that is like. So thank you for, despite that, being able to join us here today.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
So I met you a few weeks ago at this event where you were talking about Minaret Foundation. And, right away, like the topics that you were touching, you come from a nonprofit world. I could sense these are topics that are very central to what I often talk about in the workplace and business as I'm talking to leaders. It's a topic that I talk extensively about in my book. And something that you said that day around how we often live in very diverse environments. We're diverse, but we're not. You use the word plurality. And I didn't quite understand what you meant by that word, and we'll probably get into that. And that is really central to a lot of what I talk about in the workplace, is that we attract diversity, we attract people who are different, but we don't build systems to engage these people in meaningful ways. And I feel like that is really the focus of your work, is how do we take advantage of the diversity that's around us and build deeper connections with people who are different, and specifically focused on interfaith work, so bringing Muslims, Jews, and Christians together. And working on using those deeper connections and building relationships to actually enact change within society and drive civic engagement, drive change in policies. And, you specifically work on child welfare and food insecurity, and then also building these relationships like interfaith work.
That's right.
So I'm curious to know, we'll get into a lot of what I've just said, but to begin with, if you could talk to me about who you are and how perhaps your childhood or what moments in growing up defines who you are and the work that you are now doing.
That's a really heavy question. I wish I was prepped for something like that. But I'll tell you what was the catalyst for me in engaging in this work. My background is in public relations. I've been an entrepreneur most of my life, all my life. In fact, I'm still an entrepreneur. Founding Minaret Foundation has been an entrepreneurial journey. I'm often told, and I often tell others, that the only difference between a for-profit and a nonprofit is the tax status. Otherwise, a nonprofit is run almost in the exact same way that a for-profit is run. I was working on an organization called Crescent Youth, and the idea there was to bring young Muslims together around an American identity and teach them a relevant version of Islam or relevant understanding of Islam. But I was getting too old. I was aging out. I had too many gray hairs in my beard, and I was looking for my next chapter in life. But in that time, God put his hand in my life, and it was just, I was getting asked to speak at churches. And I spoke at one church, and that pastor told a pastor of another church about me. So then he invited me to speak at another church. And this is during the height of the war on terror around 2010. And they were curious to know who American Muslims are. And I spoke about a topic that was very unique at that time, the American Muslim identity, or the formation of the American Muslim identity. And so I got put onto a faith circuit. So I was speaking at churches, I was speaking at synagogues, I was speaking at universities, different Rotary clubs. And that really sparked my interest in interfaith work, getting to know everyone else. Everyone was so curious about me, I became naturally curious about them as well. And building bridges through dialogue and conversation just immediately became something that I was interested in, because it was a way to bring our communities together. You had spoken earlier about diversity and plurality, and that's something that I harp on a lot, especially in Houston, because we love to say that we're the most diverse city in the nation. We're a microcosm of what the United States is going to look like by 2050, the Kleinberg study. But that could be a point of hope, and it's also a point of failure. And it could be a point of failure because if we're not engaging one another, if we're not talking to one another, the diversity just means we live in diverse pockets throughout the city, not communicating with one another. If we're not going to the Nigerian restaurants, or if we're not going to the Pakistani restaurants or the Armenian restaurants and engaging one another and trying to understand each other's cultures, well, if we're living in pockets, if we're living in silos, this could become a big threat to us as well, because all we need is a spark.
Yeah, all we need is a spark. And
that could be a spark to bring us together, a spark to split us apart. And Harvey was a spark that brought us together. But we saw a former president who was a spark that tore us apart, right? And continues to tear us apart at our seams.
What do you think keeps us so segregated?
People might say it's I-10 and 290. I don't think it's I-10 or 290. I think it's just apathy. We're just so used to we're so diverse, we're a million cultures, every nation is represented here. And I think we're just resting on our laurels, thinking that, we've done our part. We're good. We're already diverse. We don't need to hold each other's hands. But that's the opposite. Like, we need to be holding each other's hands. We need to be engaging our neighbors, talking to one another. I often ask people whenever I go to a faith center is, how many of your neighbors' names do you know? And do you know their children's names? If not, that's problematic. That's an issue. The people who live next to you, who can provide you with safety and comfort in a time of need, you don't even know their kids' names. I'm not saying you should know their birthdays, but at least their names. Do they like apple pie, blueberry pie, cherry pie? Have you broken bread with them? Have you shared a meal with them before? That's an issue. If we're not engaging our neighbors, then what are we doing?
Yeah. And do you think a lot of it is because it's just comfortable to stay with people who are like us, who are similar to us, right? That's what we're attracted to. That's what we do when people apply for jobs, is we end up choosing people who look like us, who like the same sports team like us.
Went to the same school as us. Yeah, our comfort zones. And this is the same thing that we did in elementary school and middle school and high school. In the area of town that I grew up in Fort Bend and in Alief, it's the Hispanic kids would hang out with the Hispanic kids. The African American kids would hang out with the African American kids. The white kids would hang out with the white kids. We'd all be in our own pockets. And then the South Asian kids, there weren't many of us, so we hung out with the Hispanic kids because we sort of looked alike. And we grew up in pockets. And I think what exacerbated that issue is the rise of the internet, social media, where we can just stay at home and interact with people that we choose to interact with instead of instead of our neighbors, instead of the neighborhood kids, people who are just hanging around us.
Tell me about how you grew up as an immigrant. Was it in Houston you grew up?
I'm second generation. So my parents immigrated here in the 70s, and I was born, I'm an early 80s kid. And for me growing up, there was no one else like me. There was no other South Asians in my neighborhood. In school, there was a couple maybe. In elementary school and middle school, I was one of five. In high school, that's when immigration really started happening, and people were immigrating here, especially from our community in India and Pakistan, Bangladesh. But it was always wanting to be like someone else instead of being happy with who I was. And I think that was an issue. That was an issue because I grew up as an isolated second gen, with a cultural identity crisis, with a religious identity crisis. I didn't really identify as American. I identified as Pakistani. I even remember I didn't even like doing the Pledge of Allegiance because I was like, this isn't my country. This isn't my home. But I had never even been to Pakistan before.
Where did you think that thinking came from?
I think it came from an idea from the elder generation, our parents' generation, who didn't feel that this was home. This is temporary. Or even if it was home, it's like we weren't like them. We're different. We're different from everyone else.
It's a desire to protect their identities.
Yeah, it's a desire, and that's not just common in South Asian. That's
everywhere.
Southeast Asian, the East Asian. Everyone has this issue, right? But it takes second gen and third gen to say, actually, no, this is our home. This is who I am, right? And so we have an American flag. We sing the national anthem. We celebrate July 4th and Thanksgiving. My children are third generation Texans, and I love to say that. I say it proudly. And people are always shocked when they're like, your kids are third generation Texans? Like, absolutely.
Yeah. How do you think, growing up, how much of it was your own internal world of, because of what you've heard from your parents, that you're different, that gave you that sense of perhaps not belonging, versus the outside world making you feel that you don't belong?
I think it was a combination of both. People didn't know where Pakistan was. I'd always have to tell people that it's next to India until after 9/11. Then everyone knew where Pakistan was, right? People didn't understand our culture. They didn't understand what Islam was. They didn't know who Muslims were. I'd often be asked if I can eat meat, right? Because, popular culture, conflating us with Hinduism or even Buddhism, like this East Asian exotic faith tradition. So I think it felt isolated, and a lot of kids, I think, felt isolated because no one was familiar with who we were. We weren't studied in school textbooks. No one talked about us.
Were people curious if they asked you questions?
I do think people were curious, but they weren't curious in like, oh, this is cool. It was more, oh, that's strange. That's so weird, right? But everyone, I mean, we're
as
kids.
A kid, yeah,
we're kids. So I mean, what do we expect, right?
Yeah.
But I think now we live in a completely different time where that curiosity is not as strange. It's more of an intellectual curiosity. And that's because we're in the textbooks, we're in the movies, we're in pop culture. People are talking about us, sometimes in a negative way, sometimes in a positive way. But there's conversations about us. And we're much more predominant. We're much more visible now. And that's as Muslims. But the Asians had the same issue. People of Chinese descent, of Japanese descent, they had the same issue as well, right?
A lot of people I talk to, particularly with a Muslim background, talk about the defining moment of their lives in the U.S., their journeys, was 9/11.
Right.
And how that changed how people viewed them suddenly. How was that for you?
I mean, I remember when 9/11 happened, I was in my early 20s and I was laying on my sofa and my dad called me and he said, lock your doors. Don't go outside. Don't talk to anyone. Just stay inside for a little while and turn on the TV. That was definitely a changing moment in my life where I couldn't trust my neighbors immediately. Where it became an issue when my neighbors knocked on the door and I had just barbecued with him a few days before. And he's like, why are you guys doing this to our country? And I thought I could open my door to him because he was my neighbor. I was hanging out with him just the other day. He was roping me into an MLM scheme. And I was so close. I think it was called Quickstar or something. But then after that, he stopped doing the sales pitch to me. But it was definitely a defining moment for me because I identified as Muslim, but I wasn't very practicing. Yeah. And after that, I really started to dig deeper to figure out who I am, what my identity is, what does the Quran say about the world.
And now suddenly people who didn't, knew that you were different but didn't really know where you were from or what that meant, suddenly could put a label on you.
That's right.
And that label was like, oh, he's Muslim.
That's right. Yeah, and it wasn't just the label, it was all the connotations that came with it. Because when people would say that I'm Muslim, they would think of a very specific turban and a long beard and saying Allahu Akbar and all these random things that became popular in movies. Not, love for your neighbor what you love for yourself. You respect your mother above all else. Not our family values, not our charitable values or values centering God in our lives, but values that have been imposed upon us by individuals who really have nothing to do with our faith.
Yeah. I really thought long and hard about having this conversation on this podcast because I personally also tend to stay away from anything that involves religion because in my experience, it tends to create divide in people because suddenly people are like, well, I'm Christian, I go to the church, that's my community. And then someone's like, okay, well, that's very different from me. I'm Jewish or I'm Muslim or whatever. And then there's always like, I'm different or this feeling of like, I'm better because I believe this and everyone else should believe this. So I often like, in the workplace too, like we tend to avoid engaging in like those kind of identities, religious identities. You don't talk about that stuff.
Yeah, but that just furthers the divide, not talking about politics or religion. Let's put politics aside.
Yeah, let's
religion
put politics
puts
aside.
Such a central role in our lives. It defines how we look at one another. It defines how we treat with one another. It defines our relationship with the world. Whether you're a Christian, a Muslim, a Jew, a Hindu, a Buddhist, a Sikh, it doesn't matter. Religion plays such a central role in our lives. And to say, when you come to work, I'm just going to take that and I'm going to put it in my pocket. Yeah. I'm not going to talk about it. Throughout the rest of the day, we may wear it on our sleeves. And if we don't wear it on our sleeves, it's on full display in our heart. Yeah. When we're forced to put that away and we don't talk about such a point of unity and cast it out to be a position of divisiveness, I think that's a problem, and it exacerbates the situation that we're in Houston and in Texas. It's the most central thing to our lives. We're sticking away when we should be able to say, hey, I believe in God. Or we should be able to pray, or we should be able to openly say, at lunch, have a discussion on religion, or what church is like on Sunday, or what Muslims do on Fridays, or why Jews and Muslims have, start their days in the evenings instead of in the mornings like everyone else, or why we fast and why we pray towards Mecca, or some people pray towards Jerusalem. Why is that? Yeah. Those types of conversations will bring us together and help foster a bigger sense of empathy. Yeah. You spoke about diversity before. Yeah. At school, we're studying what happened at Coca-Cola just a few years ago, where they realized that they didn't have diversity in leadership in Atlanta. And so what they did was they started an accelerator program for Black executives. And so they would identify individuals in the Black community within Coca-Cola's platform, and they would just automatically put them into an accelerator program if they fit the bill, if they had the qualifications, and make them executives. But what they found was that this didn't do anything for the diversity in the hiring of Coca-Cola's leadership. It also didn't trickle down. So mid-level managers, lower-level managers also were not hiring more African Americans. And when they did a survey, what they found was that program actually divided people rather than brought people together. And their goal was to bring people together, was to have diversity in perspective, diversity in leadership, and to show that they could be this model company. And I think that's part of the problem that we have here in Houston is we're cherry picking ideas instead of finding innovative ways of bringing people together. So we don't have to talk about Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. What we can talk about is our unity in hating the Dallas Cowboys and having Muslims, Jews, Christians, Hindus, just talk about that, just hanging out together, because we have to see each other as humans first before we see each other as Muslims, Jews, and Christians. We have to see who's a vegan and who's a vegetarian and who loves meat, so we can figure out who the strange ones are in the audience. We can talk about brisket recipes. We can talk about Pizza Hut versus Star Pizza. We can talk about everything that's happening in the world, the values that bring us together, right? Putting food on our table, a roof on our heads, a great future for our children. These are all things that we hold in common. Is if we come together as people of faith and we can openly say that, I want a good life for my children because God says X, Y, and Z, well, that should be encouraged. It shouldn't be discouraged, because again, that's a central role. And that's what brings people together. That changes us from diversity, from a measure of diversity to a measure of plurality, right? So if we want more diversity in our organizations as entrepreneurs or in the corporate life, then instead of focusing just on race, religion, or creed, what we should be focusing on is how can we bring more people together in the workplace, right? And that trickles down.
Yeah, because it's about what we have in common, and we have way more in common
Absolutely.
than what makes us different.
Yeah, and that's not just with Muslims, Jews, and Christians. That's with white, black, Hispanic, Asian. That's with everyone. If we can see each other as humans, we can subvert hiring trends, and we won't look at people through the lens of color. We'll look at people through the lens of what are they doing for their kids? What do they want in life? What are their dreams? What are their hopes? What are their aspirations?
So, what are the kind of things that you're doing at the Minaret Foundation to bridge that gap and bring people together and build those meaningful connections?
We just had an amazing kickball tournament this past weekend at a Baptist church. Muslims versus Jews versus Christians playing together on 3 fields. We had an amazing time. People who normally wouldn't interact with one another. And we didn't talk about Islam, Judaism, or Christianity. We wore our religion on our sleeves, quite literally, right? Because we were playing, it was a versus, right? We were playing in a bracket. It was, and yes, we did get our butts handed to us. It was very unfortunate. Christians won again. Not next year, though, God willing.
Yeah.
But this year they definitely won again. But we came together and we talked about the weather. We talked about the conflict overseas. We talked about our kids. We were having discussions on ice cream, the best ice cream shop. It's just little things like this, micro discussions that took place within the tournament itself was amazing. And towards the end of it, from the beginning, you saw everyone was sitting. You see the orange shirts were sitting with the orange shirts, the blue shirts with the blue shirts, and the gray shirts with the gray shirts, representing the different teams, right? But at the end of it, everyone was, if it was a Crayola, we'd all just be one color, right? So it was beautiful. And we saw people taking pictures with one another at the end, putting them on social media, on Instagram, on Twitter, on Facebook, tagging us. And it was amazing. We weren't talking about Islam, Judaism, Christianity. We were talking about kickball and trying to beat each other. But what it ended up happening was we ended up talking about it, right?
Yes.
But in micro pockets and micro discussions. Instead of forcing people to talk to one another, we brought them together around a common issue, a common value, which was competition, right? Athletic prowess.
Yeah. So when you do those kind of events, especially in light of what's going on today, and I've seen just over the past 10 days how there's just people are automatically picking sides, and because of social media and its power and influence in our society today, you're just seeing things just get aggravated very quickly.
Absolutely.
And it's very scary.
It's very scary. And there's people in power who will push out headlines because they're profitable. They're able to push out headlines that are profitable that divide us, because dividing us creates more clicks and creates more ad impressions. We have to push back and challenge that notion by coming together. Interfaith work, multi-faith work now is more important than ever. Coming together in times of conflict, we have to show the world around us, the communities, our own state, that despite what's happening in another part of the world, despite what's happening in our own country, we can still hold hands. We can still talk to each other. We can still humanize one another, because at the end of the day, we have the same hopes, dreams, and aspirations.
But also humanize the people that are within the conflict.
That's
right.
That's right. I mean, we're not within the conflict,
no.
right? So other people are in the conflict. So it's Palestinians and Israelis overseas. But what ends up happening is that their issue becomes conflated with our issue.
Right.
So it should be. So we hear this often as, you guys hang out with Jews, or they hear you hang out with Muslims. You guys aren't fighting one another. You're not unhappy. You don't hate one another. It's like, no, what you're doing is imposing what's happening over there onto us. And even that is an incorrect imposition. It's not because someone's anti-Semitic or anti-Muslim. There's so many more complex issues that are happening over there, but you're reducing our relationship here as Americans and as diverse Americans living in different communities. You're reducing our interactions to something that's happening outside of the country. When in fact, at EY, at Schlumberger, at all these companies, we all sit next to one another in our cubicles. We sit next to each other in the boardrooms. We engage one another. We have lunch with one another. We go to happy hours together. We interact with each other all the time.
And then when we meet, as Muslims, if we are working with Jews, whatever, we see them as something different than the people over there, or like, because we all have our own biases, right? against the different religious groups. You can have a friend who's of a different religion, but still sometimes it surprises me how you can still have opinions about something that's going on over there, knowing that, you know,
but that's not you.
But that's not you. Exactly.
And that's called contact theory, right? In sociology, that's known as contact theory. It's like when I meet you, barriers are lowered. When I meet you again and we break a piece of bread, barriers are lowered even more. When I work with you, barriers are lowered even more. So I start to see you as you, as a human being, rather than a caricature that's portrayed by the media. Or a caricature that I read in books, or a caricature that I hear from someone else, right? I start to see you as you, rather than something else.
Yeah, and so more so than now, more so than ever before, now is the time when I think the work that you're doing becomes really, really important, because I think this divide and people just, you know, most people follow on Instagram or TikTok or Facebook the same people as themselves, so they see that same one view.
Within those bubbles.
And within those bubbles, and they get into those rabbit holes, and they don't see the other side. And being able to bring those people together, and also being able to talk about these things, you know, like a lot of people I follow have been putting a lot of information out there in support of Palestine. And I have one of my best friends from high school, she lives in Israel. And I sent her a message today, and she said that she had to flee with her 2 kids and go to her in-laws who live in Belgium, because it's just becoming really hard for them to live at home, right? So this is an issue that exists on both sides. And even though it's like tempting for us to pick a side, it's also seeing that the pain is universal, and, you know, we all feel it.
I mean, that's human nature.
It's human
but
nature.
I pick a side, and I pick the side of my children. What's the best for my children? What's the best for your children? And what's best for our children is that they can get along with their neighbors, that they can get along with the community around them. And that's the best way to prevent conflict. It's easy to get into conflict. It's harder to forge peace. It's significantly harder to forge peace, because you have to build trust, you have to build relations, and that takes years. But conflict, it just takes the light of a match. And so through multi-faith work, through interfaith work, when we're engaging other communities, we're building relations and we're building trust over the course of several years. And so I'm invested in my children. That's the side that I pick here, because if we can make a better life for our children here, it's going to be harder for someone in power or someone outside to say, no, let me drive a wedge between you so you can pick up assault rifles against one another. We can't have that happen here in the greatest experiment in the history of the world, which is the United States of America. We have to continue to bring people together. And just because we're a melting pot doesn't mean that our ingredients are melting with one another. We could still be oil and water. It's our responsibility to ensure that these ingredients in this pot mix well together and they taste good as well.
Yeah, and so I guess maybe framing it in that way, in terms of like picking sides, is not the right way, but it's more about how we can stay curious so that we can get to know and understand, you know, what are our neighbors going through? And like you're saying, like build meaningful relationships with them and engage with them in a meaningful way. Because yes, growing up in the U.S., how many of us have brought in people of different cultures, different races to our house, and
just our neighbors,
just our neighbors,
in the same building,
in the same building, and it's out of fear, perhaps, of, you know, being comfortable with who we are or being accepted for who we are. And it's by just having these tournaments that you have, these little interactions, you let go of that fear and you realize we have a lot more in common.
Absolutely. And I think it's a matter of 2 issues that holds us back sometimes. It's a matter of priority and courage. Priorities, we have to see plurality, or we have to see acceptance, or we have to see getting along with our neighbors as a priority in our lives, of creating that social harmony, of using that. Many of us may not vote, or if we vote, we may just cast a vote and forget about it. But people often forget getting along with your neighbors is civic participation. Getting along with your neighbors and creating a stronger fabric of society, of engaging with one another, is part of the civic fabric. It's just as important as voting. Right? If we're getting along with one another, if we're talking to one another, that leads to social harmony. So we have to prioritize it. That's one. And the second, prioritizing it and actually doing it takes a lot of courage. It takes the will to say, to reach out into the unknown and extend an olive branch, because that's sometimes what we're doing, especially if we've lived next to the same neighbor for 5 years, and then all of a sudden you're going there and you're like, should I invite them for coffee and tea? Like, why now? I don't think so.
Yeah. And they're so different than us, right? And also, you're taking a risk.
That's right.
You're taking a risk when you reach out and you're like, what if we get rejected and they say no? And so it's hard, but I think courage is about taking those risks in lives.
That's right. It's like going to the VC for the first time and pitching your idea, or asking your boss for a raise, or pitching a project idea. It takes a lot of courage and it takes risks, and sometimes you'll get a no, sometimes you'll get a yes. But it's the fact that you tried, because the next time will be easier. What do they say about cold calls? I don't expect many of your audience are making cold calls, but it takes 100 calls to get one.
Yeah,
to get one yes, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think what I'm realizing talking to you is like, like I focus a lot on building this inclusive work environment. But if we are not creating an inclusive society where we don't have these interactions, it's going to be really hard to create leaders who understand what diversity really means. How can we actually create inclusive workplace where we make room for people who are different than us?
Yeah.
I specifically wrote my book about women and how and why we're still being left behind, even though there are more women who are graduating from universities than ever before. It's been 60 years since we've been allowed into the boardrooms, but still we see the numbers are staggering, that only 8% of CEOs in the Fortune 500 companies are women. And I think a lot of that has to do with the way that we have built our system, and the values that we really adhere to in our workplace today are very limited. We're not making space for valuing difference. And so with the work that you're doing, as we interact in a more meaningful way with our neighbors who are different than us, then we can value that difference in the workplace, and would have that practice of talking to people who are different than us, and having those uncomfortable conversations and taking risks. Because I think what we see in the workplace is that people don't want to talk to someone who comes from a very different neighborhood, is a different race, because the fear of offending them.
Yeah, fear of offending them.
Yeah.
Yeah, and isn't that so silly? I would love for someone to try to accidentally offend me, because like, wow, that's so cool. They're trying to get to know who I am.
Yeah.
Right? They want to know who I am. They're coming from a good place.
Yeah. And for me, I actually, the opposite is more offending, right? Because I've been at a work meeting where we traveled to the north of Norway, because I worked in Norway for many years, and I was eating dinner with a bunch of men, and like no one cared to turn around and ask me like who I was, where I was from, because I definitely looked different. I didn't speak as good Norwegian as everybody else, but no one like was curious enough to ask me, so where are you from, Nada? Like, why are you here in the north of this country? And for me, that was more offensive, because then you don't recognize who I am in some way.
Wow,
but
I didn't think about that. That's pretty interesting.
But it's more comfortable, right? Because they're a bit like, and I think a lot of it, them not acknowledging my different identity, is because they're scared, or they don't want to feel like they're signaling me out in any way. So you can get offended by a lot of different things. And I think my philosophy in general is like not to take yourself too seriously, right? Because people have so much going on in their head and they're thinking about, but let them have the benefit of doubt and create those opportunities where conversations can take place. If they haven't asked me where I'm from, I can mention where I'm from and get that curiosity going from them, but also ask them about their cultures and their backgrounds in the same way.
We have to encourage this type of conversation in the workplace.
It's not going to happen.
No, it's going to take a cultural and a leadership shift, a mentality that prioritizes encouraging plurality over diversity. Diversity is just, again, coming back to what we were originally saying. It's, okay, we've got one Hispanic, one African-American, one South Asian, but are they talking to one another? Is everyone talking to one another? Are we getting along, or are we just trying to tick off a box? If we're ticking off a box, we're just exacerbating the issue. We're institutionalizing the problem rather than encouraging discussion, conversation, and true inclusivity, which happens when I care about who's this different looking person sitting at the table that I've just never seen before. Where's she from? What is she doing here? Let me get to know my neighbor.
Exactly. And it's exactly what you described as what we see in the workplace, is that we hire them because we think we're ticking the boxes, but then we also expect them to then behave like everybody else.
Right.
And as soon as they start behaving a bit differently or bringing in their different perspectives, we shun them down. And then we tell them, I don't think you're a cultural fit for us. Right. And that kind of language, again, is very exclusive. It excludes people who are different, instead of creating an environment in our society and our workplaces where we really value the difference that people bring in, and because they bring in then different perspectives, and that's how innovation can take place.
That's right.
Tell me about your entrepreneurial journey, because you said you were entrepreneurial all your life. You know, growing up as a South Asian, I'm sure there was a lot of pressure on you to become a doctor or a lawyer. How did you end up building a nonprofit?
I was lucky that my parents really just let me do what I wanted to do. As long as I was happy, I was financially independent, I got to do whatever I wanted to do. My father really wanted me to have an MBA, go for higher ed. I wasn't interested in education. My focus was on business. And so I started a public relations agency. This is when I started learning web design and graphic design, and everyone needed a website, and I caught that wave for a little while. I got into Cisco, and then I started doing networking as well. But that's not what I would go to sleep thinking about. It's not what I would wake up thinking about. I loved being hands-on in the greater Houston area. I was addicted to helping people. And that could be a good thing and a bad thing. And it was definitely a good thing and a bad thing in my life at one point. But everything that I learned about business at that time, I've been able to apply to the nonprofit sector. You can still be pretty well off in the nonprofit sector. You can still make important decisions and have staff and grow an agency or grow a company, grow a nonprofit in this sense, create partnerships, and have a lot of job satisfaction in helping one another and helping your city thrive and helping your community thrive, because you get to see the impact of it pretty immediately, right? When you walk away from a multi-faith event, a kickball tournament, when you walk away from a high-level discussion at the United Nations or here in city government talking about our diversity and leveraging into plurality, and you see the immediate policy changes that happen, you see the impact very immediate. It's very quick.
Yeah. Can you talk to us about some of the policy changes that you've been able to influence?
Sure. Well, in this past legislative session, the 88th legislative session here in Texas, Governor Abbott signed 5 of our bills. The first bill is called No Kids in Cuffs. It eliminates the restraint of children 10 years of age or younger in the public school system. In 2018, 2019, 45,000 children were restrained by chemical spray, physical hold, or handcuffs in our public schools. 45,000 children. Wow. 91% of them are children with special needs. Wow. So we brought educators, law enforcement, and parents together to say, how can we solve this issue? And we approached it from a faith-based lens, right? And because of that, we were able to get bipartisan support, and the governor signed it. And so we eliminated that. The second was, to become a beautician in the state of Texas, you need 150 hours of training. 1,500 hours of training. To become a judge in the state of Texas, you need 30 hours of training, right? 30 hours of training, right? It's a little silly, but 0 hours are dedicated to family violence. So if there's an issue of family violence in the courtroom, the judge can't even recognize the signs. So we worked with our faith partners and domestic violence agencies to ensure that every judge in the state of Texas now has to take 1 hour of training at the minimum, 1 hour of training on issues related to family violence. That was the second bill. The third and fourth bill are related to religious freedom, which empower parents and it ensures that children don't have to decide between their faith and their academic success. One is excused absences for children who need to take off for religious holidays. The parents just have to write a note. You don't have to get a note anymore from your synagogue, your church, your mosque, your temple. This was a big issue in the Sikh community and the Jewish community, and not even as much as it is in the Muslim community because they have so many different holidays. And the other issue, the other bill that the governor signed for us is the elimination of standardized exams on religious holidays. Can you imagine the tax test on the day of Eid or Rosh Hashanah or Vaisakhi or Diwali? That was happening in Texas, right? But we've eliminated that now. So that's no longer going to happen. And the fifth bill recognizes the Uyghur genocide in China. Right? It puts Texas in a position in the next session to start doing something about it.
Wow. I know when the first time I heard some of the policy changes that you're making, I was in complete awe and really understood the power of bringing these interfaith communities together.
Oh my God.
And actually
Absolutely.
being able to drive this change versus if we were just doing it as one community, one religious community.
Look, when an imam and a rabbi and a pastor, right, it sounds like the beginning of a bad joke. When they walk into a legislator's office, no legislator is going to refuse that appointment. Everyone is going to want to talk to you, right? We look like a bad joke walking in. But the moment we sit together and there's a legislator in front of us, their question is always, what's going on here? Why are you working together on this? Yeah. It's because our faith calls us to it. God calls us to help children, to help our neighbors who are hungry, and to ensure that we can worship in the way that pleases us.
Yeah. Now, what a fantastic way of using religion in a positive way. And we definitely need more examples of that, because with all the violence that we see and all the hate out there, religion definitely gets a bad rep. Right. But I think foundations like Minaret Foundation is leading the way in showing us that there's an alternative path, that we can use the good within all these religions, which is really at the core of it all, right? Like
absolutely.
Peace and
loving your neighbors
and valuing human life, and enacting these changes that are good for everybody in the society, right? Every children, regardless of what religion, race, gender. There are women and children, especially a lot of the policies that you enact. So I just want to say thank you for the work that you do. It's making a big difference, especially coming from a state like Texas, which is considered to be very conservative. But I think you're also taking advantage of that, because you're taking advantage of how Texas is a lot more religious than probably a lot of some of the other states.
Our faith here goes a much longer way than it does in Massachusetts or California or Oregon. We get to enact so many more changes, have so many more conversations with legislators, and our faith traditions are respected here. Texas in many ways leads the nation on progressive social change. People just don't realize that because we get a bad rap in the media for whatever reason.
Yeah, no, exactly. So, I mean, there's so much more we could have spoken about today, but thank you so much again for the work that you do, for coming in here and having this conversation. You know, some of it, like, I don't feel like I have enough knowledge or even trained to talk about these topics, but thank you for just getting in there with me. And I'm sure our audience would love to know more about Minaret Foundation. Could you leave us with some parting thoughts on how our audience could support you in the work?
So I'll leave you with three thoughts. The first is, if you want to get involved in this type of work in your community, visit minaretfoundation.com. That's MINARET foundation.com. There's a Get Involved button. So find a way to get involved. It only takes an hour. It only takes an hour a month. And if you're in the state of Texas, we'd love to have you on one of our numerous committees. You don't need a public policy or a faith background. You just have to want the desire to do something better for your community. That's number one. And actually, I only had two asks, not three. And the second, I'd like to leave your audience with a challenge for your audience that's listening here today. Challenge yourself to identify a coworker or a neighbor and provide them with the gift of a meal. With an apple pie, a slice of cake, a chili that you had last night. Just provide it to them. No conversation needed. Pack it up. Say, hey, you know what? I had some chili last night. I was thinking of you. I wanted to share something. It turned out really good. Or I had this extra slice of cake. I wanted to share it with you. That's it. Challenge yourself to do one act of kindness for your coworker or your neighbor. And I promise you, when you plant that seed will, the return on investment will be in spades.
Thank you for that beautiful ask at the end, that if we can just do this, some small gesture to ignite some conversations, to build some relationships. That's because a lot of people I've been talking to over the past couple of weeks, days since the conflict has started, they're feeling powerless, not realizing that we might not be able to control everything, but we can control our immediate
That's
circle.
right.
What's
We have
happening.
agency in our own lives.
Yes, we do.
Absolutely.
And there's so much we could do in our own small way in the communities where we are at. And it doesn't even have to be just, interfaith or religious communities. It could just be anybody that you work with who might be different or not. But reaching out to someone who you have not reached out to before and starting a connection.
That's right. 100%. We have to get out there and talk to one another and build these connections and relationships.
Yeah. So thank you for that beautiful message, especially in a time that we're going through right now.
Thank you for having me here today.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you for listening to the Something from Nada podcast. Hey, you made it this far. Give us a like and follow. If you'd like to learn more about how you can be a guest, a sponsor, or want to learn about my book, Determined to Lead, head to my website, www.nadaahmed.com. That's www.nadahmed.com. Thank you.